high. Developing countries have been deeply suffering from the COVID, from inflation, from the consequences of the war in Ukraine, and of course from climate change. There is a need to act quicker, stronger and better for developing countries. France already provided $4 billion of SDR to the IMF for loans. We are ready to do more, and we urge the other countries to do the same. France will be organizing, under the leadership of Emmanuel Macron, a summit on the 22nd and 23rd of June on a new financing pact. We should not underestimate the social and political consequences of this growing gap between developed countries with a strong level of growth and developing countries that run the risk of lagging behind. The second concern is the level of debt. To address this concern, there is a common framework which proved to be very efficient, so it is no time to improve the common framework, it is time to implement the common framework. A very last word on one key priority for France. It has been a key priority for more than 5 years now: international taxation. The implementation of the Pillar 2 minimum taxation and the completion of the negotiation of Pillar 1 digital taxation should be decided without any delay. I'm ready now to respond to all your questions.
This is Deepshika from the Economic Times. Apart from differences over Ukraine, are there any other issues which are holding up a joint statement?
No, I think that the key point which remains open is, to be very clear, the wording of the condemnation of the war in Ukraine. And once again, don't make any mistake, we will oppose any step back from the declaration of the leaders in Bali. We strongly condemn this illegal and brutal attack against Ukraine, and we don't want any step back. But once again, I fully trust India, because India is at the driving seat. India is playing a key role, and I think that India is in the best position to have this strong communique that we are all waiting for.
Mark Schiritz from Die Zeit in Germany. I was wondering whether you had any comments on the peace plan that China came up with, and whether you think that is the right direction to go.
You know, I'm only the finance minister. I'm not the Minister of Foreign Affairs, so I don't want to make any comment on those proposals. I just want to insist on the fact that this war in Ukraine has a very strong and deep impact on the world growth. Let's forget about this false idea that the war in Ukraine could be limited to the region of Ukraine and to Europe. It is not the case, and it has never been the case. If we want to have a strong, sustainable growth for the next decades, we need to have this war to be over.
Hi, sir. This is CB from the AP. Could you elaborate on whether there is a threat in the current discussions of a step back from the strong communication in Bali? If so, where is that threat emerging from?
Either we stick to the Bali communique, or France will oppose any communique during this G20 of the finance ministers. I cannot be clearer.
Minister, good afternoon. This is Arupraya Chaudhary from the Business Standard newspaper. Sir, when you say that you will oppose any step back from the Bali declaration, which countries are you referring to? Which G20 nations are you referring to which are keen towards some sort of a step back?
I'm just referring to the wording that has been used by the leaders on the war in Ukraine, with a very clear condemnation of the war in Ukraine. I think that this is not the role of the finance ministers to undermine or to change the wording of the leaders. So once it has been decided at the level of the leaders, with a very clear condemnation of the war in Ukraine and the illegal and brutal attack of Russia, we must stick to the wording of this communique. Otherwise, once again, France will oppose any communique of this G20 of the finance ministers.
Simon Study from AFP. So the nomination by the Americans of Mr. Can you hear me?
I can't hear you, so if you can...
Can you hear me better?
Yes, thank you.
Sorry. The nomination by the Americans of Mr. A.J. Banga as the possible next head of the World Bank has provoked quite a lot of criticism because of his background in the corporate world rather than anything to do with development or climate change. Do you share these criticisms or do you support his candidacy?
I think that we have a very good candidate for the World Bank. I've been discussing the point with the Secretary of the Treasury, Janet Yellen. So I look forward to meeting the candidate to give a final response to this candidacy. But I think he's a very good one.
Henrike Rosbach, Süddeutsche Zeitung, Germany. India so far took a different approach towards the war in Ukraine and tended to see itself rather than as an honest broker than to condemn the war. Do you see any movement, for example, with regards to the sanctions that are imposed on oil, on Russian oil, etc.?
Well, I just want to repeat what I just said on the fact that sanctions are efficient. Sanctions are reducing the oil revenues. So we have to implement those sanctions firmly, constantly, as we did. We have also to draw the lessons of the implementation of the former sanctions when we are in the process of deciding new ones, so that we can get the most effective effect on Russian economy. That's exactly what we are doing at the European level.
Thanks very much, Alan Rappaport from the New York Times. I wanted to ask if you've spoke with Secretary Yellen today about your concerns about the Inflation Reduction Act of the U.S. She was saying earlier today that there's a possibility of trying to strike free trade agreements with European countries so that they could benefit from the tax subsidies. Is this something that would address your concerns?
Well, I think that we all want to build a strong green industry. The Biden administration has taken very strong steps to build this green industry by providing subsidies and tax credits to the American companies. You know that in Europe we are fully determined to do the same and to build also in Europe a very strong green industry. The very last proposals made by the European Commission and by the President of the European Commission, Ursula von der Leyen, are clearly a very good step on the right direction to allow all European countries to provide the necessary private or public funding for the green industry. But one point must be very clear. This building of a new green industry must be realized on the basis of a fair competition. Fair competition among countries, fair competition among allies, which means that we are still advocating for a full transparency on the level of subsidies, on the level of tax credits, so that we would avoid a race to subsidies. A race to subsidies is, to me, one of the key risks that we are running if we don't have all the necessary transparent elements to make comparisons between the US and Europe. I trust Janet Yellen and the US administration. We have been to the to Washington with my German counterpart, Robert Habeck. We have been discussing that issue with the US administration, and we really believe all together that there is a need for more transparency to build fair competition. My last point would be to insist on the fact that there is place for everybody in that determination to build a green industry. There is a lack of semiconductors. There is a lack of green hydrogen. There is a lack of solar panels. There is a lack of chips. So there is room for everybody. But if we want to go fast, and if we want to be efficient, if we also want to protect sound public finances, we need to have a cooperative approach. That's exactly what we are advocating.
Good evening, Mr. Minister. Janani from BQ Prime here. On the subject of condemnation of Russia's invasion of Ukraine, the G7 presidency had said that new sanctions are being instituted. Which stage of these, what stage, my question is, what stage are these sanctions at? When can we expect this?
Well, you know that the new sanctions will be decided at the European level. So we are still in discussions at the European level, at the Commission level, to find common ground among the 27 member states on this new wave of sanctions. I really want to insist on the efficiency of sanctions. This is a long-term efficiency, but this is a proven efficiency. Look at the figures that have been explained and presented. $58 billion of assets that have been frozen, the fact that we have reduced the oil revenues by 46%, all those figures prove that we are on the right direction. And at the same time, I would like to insist on the fact that European countries have been able to react very quickly to the consequences of the war in Ukraine. They have been able to diversify their supply chains as far as energy is concerned. So we have been resisting in a unified manner to the consequences of the war in Ukraine, while Russia is facing the economic consequences of its brutal and illegal aggression.
Hello, sir. This is Priyashmita from Informis Media. Sir, since you mentioned that work is being done currently on the communique of the G20 meetings, I wanted to know, is there an opposition or difference in opinion from any G20 nation in condemnation of the war in Europe? And secondly, sir, what has been the progress on discussions on international taxation? It was slated as an agenda for the G20 meet. Thank you.
Well, on the communique, I don't want to elaborate too much. I think my position is quite clear. Either we have the same wording as the one adopted during the G20 in Bali, or France will not support the final communique of the finance ministers. As far as international taxation is concerned, you know that we have been working for more than 5 years on this new international taxation system. And since I'm the French finance minister for more than 5 years, I can tell you that I did not spare my efforts to put this key question to a compromise and to a final consensus. Now it's time to implement Pillar 2. And the revenues we will all get from the implementation of Pillar 2 will be quite significant and quite useful at a time when there is a need for new investments in renewable energy and in the decarbonation of our economies. As far as Pillar 1 is concerned, you know that there is already a national digital taxation in France that has been decided because of the lack of decision. Now we urge all OECD member states to complete the negotiation of Pillar 1 on digital taxation. We have been waiting too long. And you know, international community should give the evidence that we are ready not only to talk, not only to speak, but also to decide. The implementation of a new international taxation system has always been a key priority for France, so I reaffirm this key priority. It's time to decide.
Daichi Mishima with Nikkei. Thank you for taking my question. You mentioned that it is not the time to enhance the common framework. It is the time to implement it. Do you think India is willing to make a proposal as a presidency regarding the debt relief or loan haircut?
Well, first of all, I would like to insist on the importance of debt restructuring for many countries. Do not underestimate the risk of destabilization coming from developing countries. Do not underestimate what developing countries have been suffering for more than 2 years. They have been facing the COVID crisis. And why developed countries put 25% of their GDP for their economic recovery, there was only 2 to 3% of their GDP available for the developing countries. Then came the inflation. Then came the consequences of climate change, which led those developing countries with a very high level of debt. So debt restructuring is key. We have this common framework, and this common framework proved to be efficient. The way we dealt with the Chad situation is a very good example of the efficiency of the common framework. So let's stick to the common framework. Let's implement the common framework for the countries that are facing difficulties. If there is at some point possibilities to improve this common framework, we are of course open to any proposal, any suggestion. But you know, time is very short. Time is flying. And countries, developing countries, are waiting for decisions, not for improvements of the common framework. So let's decide and let's think about the future if you want, but let's take the necessary decisions for the developing countries.
Hello, Jana Rando with Bloomberg. I have a follow-up on Pillar 1. How realistic do you think is an agreement by the summer as planned? Is there anything you've heard here on the sidelines of the meeting that give you a bit of confidence that this can still be achieved? And maybe also, how do you judge the risks associated with returning to digital services taxes?
I cannot hear you very well. If you could speak a little bit louder.
Sorry, yes. I have a follow-up on Pillar 1. I was wondering if you heard anything on the sidelines here that makes you a little bit more confident that a deal can be reached by the summer as planned, and whether you see or how you judge the risks related to returning to a digital services tax that seems to be the alternative for Europe in case a deal fails. Thank you.
Well, on Pillar 1, I think that we made very clear that there is a need to accelerate at the OECD level. So when I came to the G20, I made very clear that we had concerns about the fact that technical points were blocking the negotiation on Pillar 1. At the end of this G20, and discussing with many members of the OECD, I can tell you that everybody is aware of these technical difficulties, and everybody is fully determined to fix those technical difficulties. So I hope that in the coming month and before the end of 2023, we can adopt the negotiation format of Pillar 1 and have a common framework for this Pillar 1. So we are facing those technical difficulties. I'm confident that we can fix them before the end of 2023. But I think it was useful to underline the fact that a blockade was not an option for France.
Thank you. We are going to take one last question.
Thank you, Minister, for the opportunity. This is Kiran from Nikkei Asia. India has said that it is in discussion with G20 on regulating cryptocurrency. So what is the French view on this, and is there any consensus evolving on the issue?
On cryptocurrencies. On cryptocurrencies.
On cryptocurrencies, you know that France has been advocating for a regulation of cryptocurrencies for many years, explaining that there is a need to protect the consumers and to protect the financial stability, so we stick to that position. And I think that what happened over the last month proved that there is a necessity for regulation, there is a necessity for stability, just to protect the consumers and to protect financial stability. It is one of the key roles of the finance ministers to ensure financial stability for the world, so it is worth repeating that for the cryptocurrencies too. Thank you, and thanks to all of you, and once again, many thanks to the great Indian presidency.